I'm Devonna Graham Shannon, a fourth-year doctoral student in the School of Education and graduate research and teaching associate with the Center for Urban Education. I'd like to thank you all for being here this evening. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce to you Dr. T. Elon Dancy II. T. Elon Dancy II, Dr. T. Elon Dancy II, is the third Helen S. Faison Endowed Chair and Director of the Center for Urban Education in the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh, where he also holds an appointment by courtesy in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. Before joining the Pitt faculty, Dancy served in various administrative roles at the University of Oklahoma, including Professor and Associate Dean for Community Engagement and Academic Inclusion in the Janine Rainbow College of Education, and Fellow in the OU Office of the Senior Vice President and Provost. He also held affiliate faculty appointments in African and African American Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, and the Center for Social Justice. An education sociologist, Dancy studies schools and colleges as sites of power, control, and identity negotiation. Dancy is the author-editor of 6 books and monographs. He is the author or co-author of nearly 80 journal articles, book chapters, and publications related to education and society. Dr. Dancy currently serves as Associate Editor for the American Education Research Association's journal, Educational Researcher. He is also past Senior Editor of the College Student Affairs Journal. Dancy has served as a subject matter expert for several highly visible periodicals, including Ebony, TheRoot.com, and Diverse Issues in Higher Education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. T. Elon Dancy II.
Thank you, Devonna, and good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
So before we proceed with the lecture, I want to offer my observations about the significance of our gathering. We gather today on the land placed by its creator in the care and protection of several native tribes that camped and moved through what is known as Pittsburgh. We gather on land originally shared by many indigenous nations as a place of gathering and exchange. We gather amid neighborhoods that echo the stories of African survival and that remember stations on the Underground Railroad, a context forged through the political, economic, and life plunder of a black state. We gather at a university. Human slavery, writes Craig Stephen Wilder, was the precondition for the rise of higher education in the Americas. And we gather to confront various ways the horrors of enslavement recompose and reenact themselves in the forms of American schools and schooling. This point, this idea, speaks to an urgency in research and practice that I have identified in my own scholarship. We gather at the invitation from the Pitt Center for Urban Education team, which this year organizes their activities under the theme Witnessing, Rigor, Resistance, and Responsibility in Divisive Times. With this theme, we honor the importance of the testimony, of speaking the truth of our lived experiences with injustice over time. We ask, what does it mean to witness? How can we learn from the unheard, unseen stories of writers, thinkers, and autobiographers past? How can we learn from the examples of Ida B. Wells Barnett, Fannie Lou Hamer, and James Baldwin? What might we learn from the very recent tragic and curious death of Joshua Brown, the key witness in the recent trial of Amber Geiger, the police officer who killed Botham Jean in his own apartment? How is witnessing a form of resistance? What are our responsibilities as witnesses and to witnesses? And as our speaker of the hour noted this morning, how is the research we share an act of bearing witness? As we acknowledge that divisive times are not new, what is revealed to us about work undone and possibilities for educational futures? We ask that you reimagine policies, practices, and politics in education systems and how this ultimately requires remaking the worlds in which these reside. In the words of June Jordan's essay following Anita Hill's testimony against Clarence Thomas, can I get a witness? Known to many as CUE, our vision is to be a space of learning and sharing with communities to positively transform educational opportunities and experiences. One of the ways we try to create those transformative experiences is through our biannual CUETalks lecture series. This year, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Naila Suad Nasir to the university for our fall lecture. In preparation for these powerful and timely remarks, I ask that you take a moment to either turn off your mobile devices or place them on a silent mode. Now, please turn your attention to our screen for an introduction of our featured speaker, Dr. Naila Suad Nasir.
Sometimes I go right. I went the right way, was left. Don't draw inside light, because the scribbles look so sad.
Dr. Naila Suad Nasir is the 6th president of the Spencer Foundation, which invests in education research that cultivates learning and transforms lives. Dr. Nasir held a faculty appointment at the University of California, Berkeley from 2008 until 2019, where she also served as Vice Chancellor of Equity and Inclusion. Dr. Nasir earned her PhD in educational psychology at the University of California, Los Angeles in 2000, and she was a member of the faculty in the School of Education at Stanford University from 2000 until 2008. Her work focuses on issues of race, culture, learning, and identity. Dr. Nasir is the author of Racialized Identities, Race and Achievement for African American Youth, and she has published numerous scholarly articles. Dr. Nasir is a member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association.
Won't you please join me in giving a warm round of applause to this year's featured speaker, Naila Suad Nasir.
Right. Good afternoon. I had so much fun pulling those pictures. So I appreciate the staff for the opportunity to go back down memory lane a little bit. So I'm really honored to be here with you all this afternoon. Really appreciate that beautiful words of introduction and the visuals. So the title of my talk today is, you can throw the first slide up. It's Finding Reason for Hope, Race, Inequality, and Educational Change. And I wanted to frame it in that way because I have become kind of increasingly aware that I spend a lot of time, like when you study race and inequality, you spend a lot of time in what's going wrong and in what is, quite frankly, can be a little depressing. So I wanted to frame this around, yes, there's a lot of challenges. We're going to talk about them. We're going to lay them out. And I also want to think with you about why all is not lost, why there are reasons for hope even in this kind of daunting time. And it's funny, I'm a little nervous. I don't normally get nervous before talks anymore, but I made a pact to myself this year that I wouldn't do any talks kind of on autopilot. So there's a lot more of me in this one, which I think is causing me to be a little anxious, starting with this next thing. So, you know, I spent most of my career studying issues of race, culture, and learning, and how those processes play out in schools and how they're inextricably linked to broader processes, policies, histories. But I've been thinking lately that before I was a scholar, I was actually a human being. In fact, a whole person that came to understand the world. Some of the grad students are laughing, you know what I'm talking about. That came to understand the world not only through research, but through experience, through art, through literature. I actually learned most of what I know about African American history through reading African American literature. And so I used to say that when I finished grad school, I couldn't read novels anymore because there was no abstract. And like, you just all in the detail. I just don't have time. Like, I need the. So I started reading novels again recently. And so in this talk, I'm kind of weaving together the scholar in me and the person in me. So I wanted to start with a poem. And then I'm going to come back to why I have these images from Jacob Lawrence on the screen. But I'm going to take you back a little bit with me. When I was 15, I did speech and debate. I was a part of the speech and debate club, which is a little odd because I had kind of forgotten I'd done this. I'm a very shy person naturally. I mean, you wouldn't know it anymore, but when I was younger, I didn't like to be in front of people. But I was on the speech and debate team, and there was one year where my piece was this beautiful poem by Margaret Walker. And I made it almost to like the state finals with this lovely poem. And I went back to it recently and realized this frames kind of my whole perspective and my scholarship. So I'm going to start with this poem. It's a little bit long, so kind of roll with me on this. And then you'll see how it provides kind of an arc for the talk as we continue. The poem is called For My People. For my people everywhere, singing slave songs repeatedly, their dirges and their ditties and their blues and jubilees, praying their prayers nightly to an unknown God, bending their knees humbly to an unseen power. For my people lending their strength to the years, to the gone years and the now years and the maybe years, washing, ironing, cooking, scrubbing, sewing, mending, hoeing, plowing, digging, planting, pruning, patching, dragging along, never gaining, never reaping, never knowing, and never understanding. For my playmates in the clay and dust and sand of Alabama backyards, playing baptizing and preaching and doctor and jail and soldier and school and mama and cooking and playhouse and concert and store and hair and Miss Chumby and company. For the cramped, bewildered years we went to school to learn to know the reasons why and the answers to and the people who and the places where and the days when, in the memory of bitter hours when we discovered we were black and poor and small and different and nobody cared and nobody wondered and nobody understood. For the boys and girls who grew up in spite of these things, to be man and woman, to laugh and dance and sing and play and drink their wine and religion and success, to marry their playmates and bear children and then die of consumption and anemia and lynching. For my people thronging 47th Street in Chicago and Lenox Avenue in New York and Rampart Street in New Orleans, lost, disinherited, dispossessed, and happy people, filling cabarets and taverns and other people's pockets, needing bread and shoes and milk and land and money and something all their own. For my people walking blindly, spreading joy, losing time, being lazy, sleeping when hungry, shouting when burdened, drinking when hopeless, tied and shackled and tangled among ourselves by the unseen creatures who tower over us omnisciently and laugh. For my people blundering and groping and floundering in the dark of churches and schools and clubs and societies and councils and committees and conventions, distressed and disturbed and deceived and devoured by money-hungry, glory-craving leeches, preyed on by the facile force of state and fad and novelty, by false prophet and holy believer. For my people standing, staring, trying to fashion a better way from confusion, from hypocrisy and misunderstanding, trying to fashion a world that will hold all the people, all the faces, all the Adams and Eves and their countless generations. Let a new earth rise. Let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty full of healing and a strength of final clenching be the pulsing in our spirits and our blood. Let the martial songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of men now rise and take control. So I appreciate you bearing with me on that. And in some ways, thank you. In some ways, this poem conveys what I want to say in this talk today, that when we talk about educational inequality, it is a long and sordid history. And I thought about cutting the poem because I was like, they don't want to hear all of that. It's an academic talk. But the length of it is actually, and the arc of it is actually a part of the story, that we come from this place, and it takes a while to get to another place. And we come from this long and sordid history of the denial of opportunity in order to maintain existing racial hierarchies. And it's a history of dehumanization, of denying the full humanity of those who are black or poor or non-English speakers or otherwise considered to be other in our society. But it's also a history of persistence and strength and survival and possibility that comes out of this history of struggle and pain. And I think as scholars and as human beings, we have to hold both of those things simultaneously, both the mourning and the celebration. These two Jacob Lawrence paintings, then, I chose because what they depict is everyday black community life. And those of you who know Jacob Lawrence's work knows that that was what he was about centering family and community, and about how communities reinforce resilience through this honoring of mutual humanity. Because what our ancestors understood was that to remain fully human in the face of that which sought to dehumanize you was the key to psychological and physical survival. And that what racism and enslavement and Jim Crow couldn't take away was that core humanity. And what racism takes away from those that perpetuate it is that very same core humanity. So as I move into a slightly different discourse, the discourse of research, I want you to hold the poem and the art as backdrop. And so as I talk about trends and patterns and statistics, to hold with you that those patterns represent human lives, right? They represent potential undeveloped and communities shortchanged and exploited. And I want you to hold that the past or the present doesn't always determine the future, that we may be headed to a place that we have not yet been, which is what our ancestors knew and held on to, which is how we got here, right? Okay, vast and utter shift. So the talk takes place in two parts. This is part one. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I think about and what I've come to know about the contours of racial and educational inequality. So when we say racial and educational inequality, what do we mean? What do we know about that? And to set the stage, I think it's important to recognize that this moment in our nation and this moment in education is framed broadly by two concurrent trends. One, this moment is framed by incredibly and unprecedented high levels of social inequality. And I'm going to talk for a little bit about that. Second, it is framed by changing national demographics, right? So what that graph shows is that these changing demographics are super important for thinking about equity in education, because the country is growing and changing such that the very populations that we educate least well are the populations that are growing the fastest, right? Which means that if we do not figure out how to do a better job, we're leaving huge segments of the national population undereducated, and thus the potential of the nation undereducated. It has struck me in recent years that when we talk about inequality, we're not just talking about what it means to provide opportunity to those who have been denied opportunity. We are actually talking about the very health and strength of our democracy. We're talking about the very health and future of our nation. I was at this meeting recently that was a meeting all about inequality across different domains, and some of what I'm going to say next pulls from that conversation. But it was kind of crazy. There was a couple scholars in the room, but it mostly wasn't scholars. And leading the conversation was a woman who had been Obama's national security advisor. And so there were also these other former CIA people in the room, and I had never shared a stage with folks like this. And I couldn't figure out why they were there. If you care about national security, what are you doing in a meeting about inequality? And what I realized by the end, it's because for them, the levels of social inequality in our nation are such that they are worried about the national security implications of a country where the generations coming do not have hope. What does it mean for domestic terrorism to have generations who know they will not be able to achieve what their parents have, who know there is no middle class waiting for them, who know there's no home ownership waiting for them? So it was a real deep kind of realization for me about, I had been thinking about inequality as about what's right and what's just, but it's also about our very health and future. So inequality is pervasive. I'm going to move through this set of slides pretty quickly. What I'm wanting to do is kind of illustrate something really simple, right? That inequality that we see in education is deeply connected to inequality across social sectors and throughout our society. So these graphs both show something about wealth and income inequality. The line graph showing that red line is shows that income inequality has risen really sharply over the last decade. So you can't see it, it's a little fuzzy, but that red line is the top 1%. Income, percent change in after-tax income since 1979. The red line is the top 1%, yellow line is the highest fifth, the middle line is the middle fifth, and the blue line is the bottom fifth. So what you see there is the level of income inequality over the past 3 decades has risen to astronomical levels. The other graph shows a similar thing around wealth, but shows that with respect to wealth, the top 10% of wealth holders in this country hold significantly more wealth than the bottom 60% combined. Like, we are in this moment where wealth is being held in tiny little pockets, which matters because, of course, we know that these patterns fall along racial lines as well. Again, I'm going to move quickly through these. Housing, similar patterns with housing. You see home ownership for white folks way higher than folks of color. You see their homelessness patterns, the reverse. So if you're Native, if you're Black, if you're Latinx, you're much more likely to be homeless. Criminal justice, again, similar patterns. If you are Black, you are far more likely to be incarcerated. If you are a Black man, 1 in 3 are incarcerated. This is this slide. I don't know if you all follow this story. I think it ran in the New York Times a couple of months ago. That Black women, regardless of socioeconomic status, are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. So, health disparities. And then in education, which is perhaps more familiar to many in the room, I've just called out a couple of things here. One, that white students have far lower dropout rates and higher levels of enrollment in college, with racial disparities in college enrollment growing over time. Right? We are not only in a place of vast disparity, we're in a place where the disparities are getting bigger. This makes a lot of sense when you look at the second graph, which shows that Black and Latinx students are far less likely to have access to highest performing schools and districts. When we dig deeper into these trends, you see disparities of all kinds by race have been, again, increasing over the last decade, and students from marginalized groups are much less likely to have access to just about any kind of resource that matters: qualified teachers, college prep curriculum, counselors, information about college, extracurriculars. And even within racially and socioeconomically mixed schools, you see students of different racial groups having access to very different kinds of classes and resources. And we've done a number of studies on this. I won't go into the great detail. But so disparities both across and within schools are really incredibly vast. And really all I wanted to say with all of that, because that's not anything you don't already know, but that what it means when you start to look across the systems and you see these educational patterns as deeply tied to broader patterns is that our systems and structures were designed to support and maintain inequality across social structures. And that inequality is not accidental. We didn't look up and say, oh, I wonder why kids of color aren't doing really well. It's actually in the design, right? It's in the structures maintained by norms and policies and practices. So what we're, and in some ways this is the good news and the bad news for me, right? It's bad news because you're like, that intentional work went into creating the systems that we have, but it's good news because with intentional work, we could create new kinds of systems. Right? There's nothing organic about this. So I want to, and to understand and think about those patterns that we just talked about, really requires us to dig more deeply into what we mean by race. What is race? What function does it serve? And I'm hoping I can pull this off. Like, these two quotes speak to each other to me, but it takes a little analysis to see how. So I'm going to read them both, and then I'm going to talk to you about why I think they're both important and what together they convey for me. The first is a definition of race by Michael Omi and Howard Wynot. This is from the text Racial Formation. It's kind of a foundational text. They say, race is a concept which signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of human bodies. I'm going to go back and take it apart in a minute. The second is a quote from Toni Morrison. She says, for 300 years, Black Americans insisted that race was no usefully distinguishing factor in human relationships. During those same 3 centuries, every academic discipline, including theology, history, and natural science, insisted race was the determining factor in human development. And for me, if you take these two quotes together, they signal that sometimes in conversations like this, when we look at the kinds of trends and statistics that I started with about racial inequality, we can make 2 kinds of interpretation errors. Right? The first kind is that we don't locate these trends as continuous across historical time and as a consequence of policies and practices that are intended and designed to maintain privilege for some and marginalization for others. In fact, indeed, Omi and Wynot are arguing that the very function of the construct of race, that in fact it only exists in order that we can refer to different types of human bodies and divvy resources unequally. That is its function, right? The second point is that we mistakenly attribute inequality to racial differences rather than attributing race to patterns of social inequality, right? That Toni Morrison is making the point here that while the scientific community just realized that race is not a biological thing, right, within the last couple of decades, Black folks knew it all along and saw the move of science to find meaning and attribute outcomes to race as kind of a ruse from the beginning. It was always about reifying the existing patterns. So what sense can we then make of these racialized trends on the one hand and race as a social construct and not a biological one? In education, we've talked about racial inequality in different kinds of ways. It's kind of changed over time or depending on what community you're a part of. But our language matters. I think early work on racial inequality in education talked about inequality as achievement gaps, and you'll still hear this language here and there in the kind of public space, that racial inequality appears as differences in achievement between racial groups, right? Then we got a little more sophisticated and started talking about it as opportunity gaps, which is important, right? Because that centers what have people had the opportunity to learn, not what do they know. And so we moved to kind of talking about racial inequality as opportunity gaps. Gloria Letts and Billings has kind of reframed the whole thing to think about racial inequality as education debt, right? Which is to tie it to this long history of a lack of resources such that the U.S. has accrued a debt to family and communities that have been intentionally under-resourced. And I'm kind of seeing another move, at least in the theoretical literature, to talk about it a different way, which is to think about racial inequality as opportunity hoarding, right? Which shifts the lens a bit, because the other 3 focus on the groups that don't have. But the groups that don't have because somebody else has. And why are we not talking about the processes that maintain privilege? We're so focused on the kids that are bear the brunt of lack of privilege. And when you think about what we know about creating equitable schooling environments, the first thing that happens if you go to detrack or create equity structures in a high school is the white privileged parents go crazy, right? Because they're opportunity hoarding. They're hoarding the opportunity for the good of their children. And that is a huge barrier. And so thinking about the flip side of the process, I think, is really important. And part of my point here is that if we understand inequality as being fundamentally about that if what we need to do is disrupt patterns of opportunity hoarding, well, that's actually a very different task and a very different frame on what it is we need to do. And if we see it that way, then equity perhaps is not just opening the doors a little wider for a few more people to come in, but equity is about the redistribution of opportunity. Equity is about disrupting white privilege and male privilege. So at the classroom level, it means acknowledging that our system has worked well for some and not for others, and creating equity is about shifting systems so that they work well for everyone. I don't like this picture much, but I wanted to put something up to think about even shifting the language further, that we've been talking about equity in various kinds of ways, but I think we also need to be talking about liberation, right? We also need to be talking about not just, again, what does it mean to create access, but access to what and for what purpose? If education is about making people more whole, if education is about making people more free, then we're really talking about what does a liberatory education look like, not just how do we open the doors a little wider for more people to have access to the same thing that, as somebody said earlier today, is kind of soul-crushing in and of itself. So patterns of inequality exist because we have ideologies that make them make sense. And so I didn't want to leave this part of the talk without kind of noting that there are ideologies that keep these patterns in place so that when we see them, we are not shocked. When we see them, we are not incensed, right? And I wanted to name a few of them. White supremacy, obviously, because it's the ideology that makes us not question why white people are always on the top of the hierarchies of achievement. Meritocracy, because it's the myth that the people who do well are the people that work the hardest. That allows the racialized systems to stay in place because we don't question them, because we believe that the people who have gained it through their merit. The third is that we view racism as an interpersonal thing, about some people not liking other people, or some people acting in discriminatory ways, but that it's both interpersonal and in the past, so that we've actually moved past systems of racism. And the fourth is that we focus on individuals rather than systems, which all of those kind of suggest, and that as long as we're focusing on how well an individual did or an individual's trajectory, we're not looking at the function of the systems to do exactly what they're doing. This is my son. This is a couple years ago, so he's got like more facial. He's got an unusual amount of facial hair for a kid. He's like maybe 12 in this picture. It's very odd. He's got like a little beard. He's like, Mom, feel my beard. But I put this up because I had this major epiphany about race and how it operates about this time when he was this age. And I'm going to tell the story, and I'm going to tell it kind of quickish because I got to get to the hope part. The story starts, my son is 12. My ex-husband is over for dinner because we have that kind of cool like ex-husband, ex-wife thing, and for the kids and whatnot. And my ex-husband has all these weird dietary things, and he had this vegan ice cream he had brought that he was going to have for dessert, but he left it in the freezer. So he drives off, and he forgets this vegan ice cream. Well, who eats vegan ice cream? It's just not eat the ice cream or don't. It's not essential to the story. But so he drives off without his vegan ice cream. He calls, I left my ice cream. I'm going to come back and get it. Okay. I say to my son, Daddy left his ice cream. He's like, I'll take it outside, because he's a goofy 12-year-old, and he just wants to stand outside on the corner with a carton of ice cream. So he's standing out there on the corner with this carton of ice cream, and a neighbor who's walking his dog, and it's about dusk. The neighbor who's walking his dog walks by, and we live in a pretty mixed-race neighborhood, relatively upper middle class. And the neighbor stops and says, what are you doing here? And my son says, waiting on my dad. Like he's a goofy 12-year-old. He has no frame for what's happening in this moment. And the man says, well, I've never seen you here before. And my son is like, I live right there. Like, I live right there. That's my house. And so the guy drives off. My son comes in the house, and he's like, this weird thing just happened. And he's telling me what happened, and like my blood is boiling. And then my ex-husband gets there for his ice cream, and my son tells him what happened. This is when you appreciate an ex-husband. My ex-husband gets back in his car and finds the man. and he says, hey, that was my son. Don't talk to him. Like, what were you talking? Well, don't, like he lives here. You have no right to question him. Don't talk to him. And the man says, look, I was just protecting the neighborhood. So even in this exchange, like he doesn't get that what you have just done is changed his whole frame. Because now we have to have a whole conversation around why what was this man's intentions? How was he viewing you? And the man said, well, you know, he was standing out there flailing his arms. He's holding a carton of ice cream. So he couldn't have been flailing his arms, right? But it's how this thing in his head mushrooms out, right? And so what I realized in that moment is what it means to be a black boy is that you don't get to be a black boy, that your developmental needs don't get to be met by the world around you. And you have to cope with a world that right when you have a need for competence, kind of you get treated with suspicion. Right when you have a need for autonomy, you get treated by teachers who are increasingly wanting to control your body and your activities. Right as you're needing connection, you're othered by teachers and administrators and random neighbors walking down the street. Right when you have the need to make mistakes and explore, you're adultified and expected to behave as more adult than you are. And that inability for you to get your basic developmental needs met by the world around you is how racism operates. It's one important way that racism operates. So I'm going to move through this part really quickly. I think there are several really high-level equity concerns right now that I wanted to just highlight. Segregation is worse and is worse than it has ever been. Right? Segregation is worse now than it was in 1954 when the courts passed Brown versus Board of Education. That's wild. And it creates schools that are inequality factories. Right? I don't know if you, Nicole Hannah-Jones is a journalist, the one who just did that lovely 1619 series on Black history for the New York Times. Has been writing about integration as the only intervention that's actually created equity in schools. And we can certainly argue about whether integration ever actually happened, because some of us would say it was desegregation. But point taken, integrating schools or desegregating schools was the most successful intervention of our time, and it is virtually gone. That is an equity challenge of our time. And it's also connected to the gentrification patterns in cities, the skyrocketing of housing costs that will only deepen this inequality. School closures are a major equity issue of our time. School closures disrupt communities and negatively affect the most marginalized. Again, I'm not going to say a lot about each of these, but it's been super interesting to watch in cities across America what happens when school districts realize they don't have enough bodies to fill all the seats, and in which communities they close schools, and the relationship that that severs between communities and school districts, major equity issue of our time. We underfund public schools at every level, from pre-K to K-12 to higher ed, vastly, egregiously, very unwisely, and again, I could say a lot more. We view children, families, and communities as the problem, and when I mean we, I mean teachers, school districts, school systems, researchers. As a society, we start with deficit frames and go from there. It's a major equity challenge of our time. And we think about educational access in narrow ways. We think just about access to some core curriculum, but if you think about what it is that children and young adults really need in school, it's actually a broadening of the epistemological lens. It's a broadening of the content, that we actually need to be learning different things. So there's been these studies recently on ethnic studies courses, and these kind of quant people have moved into this space a little bit and did these carefully controlled causal studies of some of the cities that have gone to, some of the districts that have gone to mass implementation of ethnic studies courses, and the results are like blowing their minds. They have not seen interventions with results this strong. Right? It's so much so that they were like, let me go back and check the data. But content matters, and so if we just think about access to canonical content, we're actually missing where a lot of the power is. And then finally, and majorly for me, we don't assess what we care about most. We assess what we can measure. So standardized test scores tell us actually very little about what students learn. They tell us actually very little about what students know. They tell us actually very little about possibility. Right? So I'm going to move now to thinking in the last little bit of time about what it looks like to chart a path forward and why we should be hopeful. So I'm going to share two quick examples from research studies that I've done where I have seen amazing things happening for children in schools, and then I have my list of reasons, reasons to hope that I'll share with you. So this first example comes from my work studying the African American Male Initiative in Oakland, California. It's a district-wide initiative focused on African American male students. One of them started in 2010 with a superintendent that was looking at achievement patterns and said, we are underserving black male students in an egregious way and we have to do something about it. What he decided to do was create an Office of African American Male Achievement. It's actually, I would tell a longer story if I had time, but he hired a director, and when the office started, that was the only staff member. And the guy tells a story about being introduced at the board meeting as the Office of African American Male Achievement. You know, this is in a district of, you know, hundreds of schools. And everybody waiting for the staff to walk up. And he was like, it's just me. But, you know, he takes this opportunity, builds this organization, and they started in all of the high schools, all black, all male courses, 1 period a day, not mandatory, totally optional. And my research team studied what happened in these all black, all male classes. And we found many really interesting things. More recently, they've done a causal analysis of the program and found that it reduced dropout rates for black male students by 43%. And we found some really interesting things. This is the book where we detail the findings along with some of the instructors and students. And I'll just talk about a couple of these. The first is that the focus of the teaching was actually about humanization and about love. And that wasn't a frame we brought into the study. That was actually what the instructors told us. These black men that came from community told us that the reason they were there, the reason they were teaching, is because they wanted to create a space of love for black boys. And so that was the essence, that was the heart of the work they were doing. That's why we call the book We Dare Say Love, right? And which ones do I want to talk about? I'm going to talk about reframing stereotypes because I spent a lot of time debunking, reframing, talking with the youth around these stereotypes about what it means to be black and male. And what was important about that is this was, for many of the young men, the only place outside of their families where this conversation was happening. And so they had access to a community where they could think about in what ways were these stereotypes impinging upon their lives and what were other ways for them to be in the world without holding all of that. The other thing I'll talk about before I move on is just that this was a place that pulled teachers not from the traditional teaching pipeline, which I think is really interesting as we think about a space of possibility and what it means to create alternative structures. They recruited teachers from community-based organizations, and part of the reason that happened was just a matter of pragmatics. You know, the guy who started the program, Chris Chapman, initially thought, well, we'll just pull the black male teachers that already exist in the high schools, right? Yeah, no, there weren't any, or there were very few. And so they had to create a pipeline, and that was a whole long political thing. But in the end, what they say is, we hire for will and train for skill. So we pull people from this community-based, these community-based organizations. Why? Because they understand the value of these kids. They understand the value of the community. They understand that it's really important to come from a place of strength and asset. And if they get that essence, then we can teach them how to teach. And they do. They have a long, elaborate professional development program that I think is actually really essential for the kind of results that they've seen. The second example comes from some work I did around mathematics, and this is studying a math department at a high school, a multicultural high school, that attained phenomenal results. Over the course of about a 20-year period, they decided they were going to deeply work on equity issues. They developed an equity curriculum and worked together to really hone an equity pedagogy. This is the cover of a book I wrote with them, just kind of making the approach public at a moment when they were actually all about to quit because the district pressures were so great. That's a whole other part of the story. But they created this amazing thing. They eliminated achievement differentials by 12th grade. So kids come in 9th grade, there are differences by race and gender. By 12th grade, there are no differences by race and gender. And no difference with respect to achievement, no differences with respect to saying how much they, to course continuation, no differences with respect to how much they like math. Compared to students in comparison schools, they had more students in higher level math classes, so more students went on to calculus, and more students who reported liking math and being engaged in their math classrooms. How did they do this? They did this with a philosophy that had the following components, kind of philosophy and action. Part of the philosophy was that they saw all teachers and students as learners, right? So taking this typical achievement hierarchy and turning on its head what it means to learn and do math, what they argued is that they worked from strength and made space for vulnerability, so kind of understanding that nobody wants to be in a learning environment where you're just continually told that you don't know and you can't do. So they created spaces where students were able to be competent, where students were, could find their strength and thus make space for the moments when they didn't know, when they needed to be vulnerable. Teachers also made themselves vulnerable. I mentioned this, they redefined what it meant to be smart in math. They highlighted and really centered relationships, and they did some things structurally. They created a block schedule where kids were in math 2 hours a day. That meant a number of things. That meant they could do the kind of deep, engaging, mathematical thinking type tasks they wanted to do, but it also meant that if you failed geometry, it was only a semester-long class. You could take it again and still be on track to take calculus, right? So building into the structure the ability for people to fail and rebound was really important to their approach. So I'm going to keep going because I want to get to your questions and thoughts. So a few trends that I say towards what we know is right. I think we're in a moment where we have better language and research on the implications of the long history of educational oppression. We are talking about oppression, we are talking about racism, we are talking about anti-racism in a way that gives me hope. I'm like all about Ibrahim Kendi and like cheering him on with the work that's both scholarly and public-facing. I think it's a great moment. We have new evidence about culturally sustaining pedagogies and the role of belonging in relationships, and I think this is making its way into the world, into schools, into research circles, that there is a new acknowledgement that actually there's a lot of power in using teaching approaches that build on the strengths of young people in their communities. There's this interesting moment right now where there's an opportunity. I think people are realizing that the standardized testing has failed all of us, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't give us the information that we need to have. And I think we're in a moment where we could create something new, where the space is open to create measures of learning that assess the things that we really do care about. And finally, we're in this moment, given the national context, where there's renewed attention to thinking about outcomes that are broader than narrow academic outcomes, right? Civic engagement and youth activism as a version of civic engagement, implicit bias. Like, what are the things that allow young people to become and engage as full citizens? And I think that widening of the lens is really important and bodes well for the future of education. And finally, research-wise, we're in this space where we're seeing the increase in participatory methods that don't have that typical power relationship between the researcher and the research, and partnerships, new kinds of partnerships where practitioners and scholars are creating knowledge and running projects together. And I wanted to put this up just in terms of the historical moment. This is a quote from Martin Luther King from probably about 67, maybe. All this tells us that white backlash is nothing new. White America has been backlashing on the fundamental and God-given rights of Negro Americans for more than 300 years. With all of her dazzling achievements and stupendous material strides, America has maintained its strange ambivalence on the question of racial justice. And I found this and I thought, white backlash is nothing new. And we will move on. And I really appreciate Vanessa Seidel-Walker's thoughts on this, where she's studied teacher activists and has argued that these moments of backlash and kind of the closing of opportunities have always been there. They've always been a part of the cycle of progress. And what activists do in these moments is hunker down and plan and wait for the next window to open. And that feels like our work in this moment, to wait for the next window to open and have a plan when it does. And I want to end back with this final paragraph of the Margaret Walker poem. Let a new earth rise. Let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty full of healing and strength and a final clenching be the pulsing in our spirits and our blood. Let the martial songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of men now rise and take control. Thank you. Forgot what to do.
Good evening. I want to thank you all again for coming, and I want to thank you, Dr. Nasir, for a wonderful presentation. And we want to take some time now to get into some discussions about what you shared with us. And I want to step back a little bit to some of what you shared with us, beginning with the Jacob Lawrence poem, and thinking about how that poem juxtaposes the varying type of good, bad, ugly, but beautiful experiences
Right. Yeah.
in Black communities, but how we still hold out for hope, and we envision a future of justice and equity, and we believe that's going to happen. But our current reality, particularly as you pointed out to us and what we see in terms of the inequities in health, in housing, in wealth, definitely in education, that we still have a ways to go. So I'd like to begin with a question, particularly as you talked about liberation. And what does it look like, in your view, a liberatory education in a society that is so deeply rooted in white supremacy and white supremacist ideologies, policies, practices that have really taken hold in our local, state, and federal government in terms of education? So what would that look like today, given all that has happened over these hundreds of years in terms of trying to maintain bondage and maintain us in bondage and in chains, particularly with regards to education?
Okay. Well, that's a good question. What does it look like? I guess I've been on this thing lately that as scholars, as academics who are committed to seeing the world change, that we actually have to be working on two fronts simultaneously, right? One of those fronts is about tinkering, making the current inequitable systems a little better. Like, what does it mean? And I think the Obama era was in some ways a lesson in this, right? Like, what are some of the policies? What are, how do we incrementally work to strengthen current systems? I do think the Obama administration got education very, very wrong. Race to the top was abysmal. But some of the federal policies, for instance, around for-profit prisons, for-profit colleges, around funding, utilizing Pell Grants in prisons, those for me are good examples of how you can use policy to make incremental change to increase access. So I think that's one way it looks is, we've seen this recently with some of the discipline policies in school districts. So it's not that there's not, kind of movement. But I think at the same time, we need to be working at the edge, which is what would it look like to envision an entirely different education system?
Yes, right.
And I'm not sure that we know that we're holding yet a collective vision about what that looks like. And I think having and holding a collective vision is actually really an important first step in being able to bring anything into fruition. And what's interesting is a lot of the ideas, like when you stop and think about, so where I start with, okay, what would the system look like, is what do I want for my children, right? I have a bunch of children. They're actually not even all children anymore. But what I want for them is to be in a learning space where they are experiencing joy, where they are feeling empowered, where they are finding themselves. And I think that's the place to start. Is what kinds of human beings are we wanting to support the development of with the way that we educate? And if we start there, well, we want people that are fully empowered, that can dream a new future, that are persistent and passionate and understand how systems and governments work so they can build something new for us, that can, scientists that are going to fix this climate mess we done got them into. So I think that the vision the vision that we're holding at the cutting edge has to be really ambitious and collectively created.
So some of the conflict that can occur, you talked about segregation, and our schools are more segregated now than they were when Brown v. Board came out in 1954, and when the Civil Rights Act came out in 1964, and now we really started to see deseg take hold. So, but there are a lot of people who believe that we should go back to that pre-Brown time, where we had black children being educated by people in the community. Teachers lived in the community, they cared about the kids, they loved the children, and education was happening all around them, whether they were in a school building or in the community.
Right.
And children had a much more positive racial identity about themselves during that time. In fact, Dr. Siddle Walker talks about that when she talks about the value added in her work in during those times of segregation. So when you're talking about what we want for our children, do you envision it being black children being educated by black teachers, by the community, where they can gain more of a stronger racial identity about themselves? Or do you see them in desegregated or integrated? I'm one of those that see them as being very different. Do you see them in desegregated or integrated type of schools?
Yeah. I think that's a great question, and it's a great question for us to be wrestling with. And at different times in my life, I would have answered it different kinds of ways. There are a lot of pieces to that, though, right? Like, one piece is, I think that we have to both honor the amazing things that were created by those black teachers that Vanessa studies, but not romanticize the time, right? It was a time where black people were taxed twice. Taxed for the white schools, and then self-taxed on top of that to support the black schools, right? It was a time where the world that those teachers and administrators were preparing kids to move into was overtly and explicitly hostile. Yes. It was a time where there was not another profession for black people with degrees but to go back into their communities and teach. So I don't romanticize the time when segregation was forced and people and people made the best of it to create schools that were supportive for kids, right? And the resource differences were ridiculous. The books, the school buildings, you're talking about kids learning in spaces where there was no heat or no roof, so yeah. And we know that part of what happened when desegregation occurred is that the black teachers were fired. Right. So that was it's kind of in some ways, we talked about this a little bit earlier, in some ways it's a major way that desegregation failed to be integration. Because if we were integrating, right, we would have kept a balanced teaching force, and that's not what happened.
At all. We're still struggling with that, obviously.
Yes, with the historical kind of consequences of that. I guess what I want, and I think blackness is globalized, is demonized globally. So yes. And there are societies that have done a much better job of creating a true kind of multicultural society. And in a multicultural society, I think you can still have strong identities with your group and fully engage the society as a whole. And I think we need to move towards a future where both of those things happen. I'm reminded of I talked about this a little bit earlier, the 1935 piece by W.E.B. Du Bois, Does the Negro Need Separate Schools? And he's writing in 1935, and he says, what children need to learn is to be surrounded by people who care and who believe they can learn and that they're smart. Can black children have that with white teachers? Probably not. That's what he concludes right, in 1935. And I guess I would like to think that we could create a system of schooling where we honor what it really means to learn, what it means to learn towards a multiplicity of pathways, what it means to learn a range of content, so that we're teaching young people to all be civically engaged, to understand the full history of this country. I don't think that's impossible, despite what this moment appears to be. And some people have argued this is the last gasping breath of white supremacy. I would like to think that.
That is hope, and we're talking about hope. We did get into that. So, do we have any people who would like to ask some questions? Because I will ask questions, and we'll just talk about it. But we would like to open this up to you all and give you the opportunity to ask Dr. Nasir some questions. There are mics. Is there just the one mic here? Okay.
I'm a little hoarse, but I think everything you said was so accurate and on point. You're closer to the mic. Okay, everything she said was accurate and on point. I was a tutor in middle school, and what I discovered, they weren't taught mathematical law. There's law in math,
Right,
and once you get, you got it.
right.
And my brother became a scholar.
Mm.
He went to school, was going to school for, civil engineering, but didn't have the funds. To me, I think education begins in the home. It doesn't begin in the school.
Right.
When I'm walking and talking to my child,
Right.
I'm teaching her addition and subtraction with bears and chairs. When we're sitting at the table with pancakes, that's division. You know what I mean? So it starts in the home, so maybe we should educate the parent first.
Right.
And then they can educate our kids in their home. We're looking too much at the school to do what we should be doing for ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
And I honestly can say that because I got a daughter who's smart and bright as can be.
Yeah.
And I told her, I said, look, you're gonna outthink them, okay? When you're in the class, if there's another student who doesn't understand, you're gonna go over, you're gonna help that student. The math teacher calls me up, Miss Young, what did you do? Your daughter is so bright, because I
Right.
told her, you don't laugh at that student that doesn't understand.
Right.
You go over and help them, because she got too many people in the classroom.
Right.
So I think Pittsburgh Public Schools have failed us because I was educated here, graduated in 76. They was telling us the same thing in 2000. So why are the statistics the same?
Right. Right.
That's what I have to say.
Yeah, yeah. And I have a number of reactions. I think that you're absolutely right on a number of fronts. But I also want to caution us when we say something like education begins in the home. I think that undoubtedly that is true. And kids are natural learners, right? If you don't get in their way, kids learn stuff. They right? They follow their passion. They my son is an avid YouTube kid. He's learning all this science videos on YouTube. And why does a Cheerio not pop down when you put the spoon on it in milk? And so I think part of the challenge is that narrative has been used to position Black families and Black communities as not doing enough, as not being enough, at the same time that the schools are actively sorting and providing opportunity to some and not others. So we have to disentangle it a little bit. Like it is, what happens in the home is really important, and in all homes, kids are learning, right? It's just a matter of how, what happens to them and what they learned when they get to school. And so what sounds like part of what you've done is intentionally align the way that you've parented your kids with the type of skill sets that are valued in school, which is something that a lot of us learn, this is what we need to do, but that shouldn't be necessary for our kids to be viewed as smart and to have potential. It is necessary, but it shouldn't be. I don't know, will you do the calling on people?
Is this on? Yeah, there we go. You thought you were nervous. As we talk about disrupting white supremacy, and I agree, I think that these times are fodder for, really making some strides that way. I'm actually from San Antonio, and as I'm watching what's happening with the Latino population, which is not limited to what's happening in San Antonio, it's going on all over the country. Do you have concerns that, I have concerns, that for the African American community and for the indigenous community, First Nations community, as the Latino community is also vying to get their needs met and are starting to close that achievement debt in their own community, we are not making the strides that they're making. And so my concern is, as we disrupt white supremacy, that there is another supremacy that we will have to contend with for our children who are African American or First Nations.
Yeah, I hear you. I think I feel like that. So I spent a long part of my career as the Vice Chancellor of Equity and Inclusion at Berkeley, where there's every group you could imagine represented, and there were moments when it seemed like people felt like this is a zero-sum game and you're fighting other groups for resources. And I guess I want to caution that as a frame, that if we had a truly liberatory education system, it would meet the needs of all, right? We would all be multilingual, because we would realize that actually to be a productive citizen in this global world, we all need to be multilingual. So I don't see the needs of some communities as being pitted against the needs of others, because in a truly functional system, all of the needs would be met. In the current system, yeah, I do think that that's a dynamic, right? You think about the Ebonics debate from the 1990s in California, which is this kind of hilarious, I mean, it's not hilarious, it's hilarious but not hilarious. But what happened was, because there was a pot of money in the district for language development and for second language learners, folks that were concerned about black students decided that they were going to call out that Ebonics is a language and utilize some of those second language learner funds to use Ebonics as kind of a bridge for teaching, and it blew all up in the media. It was a horrible mess. The district retracted. I think that's an example of what it looks like when people feel like they're competing. But what it looks like when we create a system that meets the needs of everyone means that we're moving towards a collective future where all skill sets are needed, where all ways of being and ways of knowing are honored, where all of the histories are respected, and where we can see actually it's the same thing that has caused us to put children in cages at the borders is the same thing that has caused us to incarcerate black people, is the same thing. Like, it's the same stuff. And so in that way, liberation for some of us is liberation for all of us. If that makes sense.
I was wondering if you could make a comment about using the term white supremacy so much that black is not supreme, and if we don't say black supremacy, how can we establish a trajectory that makes us not have to consider a racial group that has been harmful historically to people as supreme, but when we put black in front of it, what might that mean to us, particularly when we're looking through a liberated gaze?
Yeah, I appreciate your point. The language matters, right? I think I use that term to call out the ideology that we have kind of bought into as a society. But I hear you on the importance of what is the language we need to disrupt that ideology. So we've labeled it, right? And what's the language we need next to not reproduce it? I feel like that's the question here. I don't have a good answer. But I think it's a really, really important question for us to consider kind of as a community.
Excuse me. At the beginning of your speech, you stated that when the topic of race comes up, it's usually not until it's a problem. It's not until it's problematic that people discuss it. I was wondering, like, if in your studies, if you ever thought that the actual concept of race as opposed to acts of racism themselves are actually destructive. The actual categorization of people, as you're using all through the night, black, white, whether you say black supremacy or white supremacy, but you're actually classifying people into differences. However, then when you spoke of sort of remedies towards this, you used words like love, humanitarianism, a number of other things that deal with the commonality of human beings. However, we don't have any sort of systematic way of referring to each other in terms of commonality. We only have ways of referring to each other by our differences, and that is essentially what race is. We have a society predicated on people's differences, and their commonalities. However, when we are trying to strive towards these solutions, we're trying to go towards commonality, but we don't have anything systematic. So what I'm trying to say is that, do you think just in these words, like, I would personally, just in my opinion, I find it like sort of offensive, because we're constantly overlooking the fact that you're saying to somebody, you're different than me. Like, for instance, I don't think that there's anybody in this room that would have a family that wouldn't do something or go beyond means to save something or protect their family. And what has happened historically is that minorities, whether they're African American or Hispanic, they seem to have accumulated allies across the so-called board, and those allies are usually referred to as white liberals. And what happens is that so much progress is made, and then the steam seems to run out of the efforts over time. And I just wanted to say in conclusion I think that when people go home at the end of the day and you're with your family and everybody else is with their family, it's gonna take something to say that all the people that you're trying to help are actually more like you and not different. Because everybody, regardless of how well you intend, they're going to say, if we continue on this system, they're going to say at the end of the night, I'm not black. Why should I keep helping people? Until we see something in common with each other, I believe that the effort or steam will continue to run out.
Well, I mean, I think what you're pointing to is the quagmire of race and racialized language, right? On the one hand, what we know and what I talked about was the fact that categories of race only exist in order to oppress.
Right.
That's why they exist.
Right.
Right.
Like you said.
But not talking about it doesn't make it go away either. And I was in the Netherlands last year. It was really one of those hilarious cross-cultural experiences. And we were talking about, I can't remember the term that we used, but it was like an NSF-funded meeting with scholars from the Netherlands and scholars from the US, and it was around representation in STEM, or diversity issues in STEM, or I can't remember the language. It's actually important, but I can't remember it. Because what we realized midway through the first morning of the meeting is that for us, for the US scholars, that word signaled we're talking about racial disparities. But for the scholars from the Netherlands, they were thinking, some of them were in the room thinking we're talking about some totally different thing. Right? The Netherlands has a history, but they're not tracking racial group membership because they argue that if you track it, you reproduce it. And yet, in their society, there are, it was super fascinating. We're in this meeting, all white scholars from the Netherlands, and there's no problem with race here. What you all are talking about in the US, that doesn't exist here. So, you know, we get that you all have a problem with that. We really don't. But then later on that day, we met with some scholars of color, and they were like, that's bullshit. Like, yes, there are problems. Just because they don't want to talk about it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And so I don't know, there's something to work out there, that here we are, right, in this society that's really structured along racial lines really heavily. And just going colorblind doesn't make those structures or the consequences of them go away. And we need to aspire to something different.
I'm an educator. I teach second grade for PPS. And something that you said that was very interesting to me is offering a little glimpse of hope of how we could change or break through some of these barriers that our children are facing. And the thing I think, I just wanted to offer a perspective of culture as a way of doing that. And there was a question that you made, whether does it make sense for minority teachers to teach minority students, black teachers, we have a new instrumental teacher. He's white. And I teach at a minority school where it's 90%. This is his first year here, and they absolutely love him, adore him. he has no behavior issues, no anything. And they don't know him, they're just meeting him, and what changes the way that they respond to him than they respond to someone that they've been around forever. And I would like to offer the perspective of culture. Culture is not built on just like race, which
That's right.
you know, is how I receive you, the things that you care about, what's important to you, what you're into. And I would like to offer that I believe that is what is going to change education system, the way our country is ran. And you can see it in what's going on with the youth. I'm also a parent. I have a child who's in high school. And what I'm noticing and the things that they care about, they're so disengaged in the things that we're doing in school currently. And when they find someone who comes in, maybe they could be young, they could be older, they could be black, they could be white, they could be anything, but who embraces their culture. And their culture is really different than even what me as a parent, my son's culture is so different. Yesterday, Saturday, he was teaching me this dance move, and he pulled it up on YouTube, like, I need to learn this, you know, just in understanding his culture, caring about what's important to him. And I see the youth, the generation, they are, these ideas that we have, the supremacy and things like that, they're moving away from that. They're embracing each other's differences, the things that they care about. It's like if we have a common thing that we can come around, we can learn and build off of each other. And they're starting to take away these labels and things like that. And I'm hopeful just in that. And I feel like if the educators and people in positions that are making these decisions for them embrace more their culture, what's important to them. There was a rap or a video that went viral on YouTube with a young man who made the rap about how school is stupid. They're not teaching them anything that they care about, anything that they need for their future. And that should be like a wake-up call to us as educators and people in the system who are making these decisions for their future, their education, their curriculum, and things like that. They're begging and asking, like, they don't care about what color you are. They don't care about what race you are, what female, male. They want someone who cares about what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they're saying. And I think if we can somehow get the systems to develop that understanding and start building around that, then we're going to see our students grow in spectacular ways.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I would just maybe only add that they're also worried about the environment in ways that I think is a bonding something across these kinds of racial lines. I think it's kind of fascinating. Like,
After this young lady asked her question, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the new evidence around culturally sustaining pedagogy in terms of, I think you mentioned, in belonging, and because the lady who just asked her question, I made her comment, I think it would be great to hear a little bit more about what you mentioned.
And unfortunately, this will be our final question.
Oh, that puts a lot of pressure on me.
Yeah, no pressure.
It's actually not a question, though. So I just wanted to thank you because I'm a middle school teacher, and I had a moment today where I've been, so I would be an ally, but I think I'm more of a disruptor, and some of my colleagues are out there, so I have to be careful. But I tend to get in trouble quite a lot. John Lewis says get into good trouble. Sometimes it's not good trouble for me. But it's like fighting against systems, I think. And this morning, I was talking to a colleague and I threw up my hands and I was like, I can't go any further with this situation for this one student. And coming and hearing you talk, like, reinvigorated me to recognize that not only can I, but like I have a responsibility to do that. And I always see that responsibility, but sometimes the systems interfere so much with just one person trying to change something. But I think for me, like in this situation, it's giving every student accessibility to opportunity, and you mentioned that, and fighting for the rights of some students to have that, regardless of whether it makes people uncomfortable. I think it was the gentleman before in the tan jacket was talking about maybe not looking at the differences so much, but sometimes I feel like we have to, because we have a responsibility to recognize that not only are there differences, but there's also a lack of access to that opportunity. And so by recognizing that, we're allowing the access to that. So anyway, I just feel like I have to go back and cause some more trouble. So I want to thank you for that and just like reinvigorating me a little bit. So
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Do you mind giving us those closing thoughts around this new evidence around culturally sustaining pedagogies and whatever else you would like to?
Yeah. Well, I talked about some of it. Some of it is the research on ethnic studies courses, which I think is just, it's some of the strongest interventions about, strongest evidence about the power of interventions. So San Francisco Unified went to instituting ethnic studies courses district-wide, and the effects were just off the charts around graduation rates, grades, like all of the measures. That's one. Two, the reauthorization of the Every Student Succeeds Act had some really interesting new opportunities for districts to evaluate themselves on measures other than just standardized test scores, which is what predominated the prior iterations. And that includes thinking about opportunities for social-emotional learning differently. So these other types of variables that I think get us closer to what it looks like to create a humanizing learning experience. So I guess I'm just starting to see the tide, both the policy tide, the practice tide, and the research tide shift to a broadening and thinking about these other kind of softer variables that will take us towards equity practices.
Well, thank you so much.
All right,
We
thank
really
you.
appreciate your talk. We appreciate you spending time with us and giving us a lot of food for thought, a lot to think about, and challenging us to be disruptors to really bring about change. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you coming back up here? Oh, you're going to close it out? Okay, well, let me stop all this then. Sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Nasir. Thank you for your scholarship. Thank you for bearing witness. Thank you for powerful words that are timely, inspiring, and challenging. It is my hope that those of us who have been fortunate enough to experience what you have shared will be motivated to advance the work through our own networks, roles, or areas of influence. In honor of those who have aptly demonstrated their commitment to doing the work, we will now present our Let's Go Awards. When the center was founded in 2002, it was from the vision of one man and his commitment to improving education opportunity, our former dean, Alan Lesko, who I think I saw in the audience. Alan, would you please wave your hand, stand, and be recognized? Yes. In his honor, the Alan Lesko Award for Excellence in Urban Education is presented to an educator, leader, or community member who demonstrates outstanding work and commitment to innovation and improvement in urban education. Today, we are fortunate to honor 3 individuals whose work exemplifies this commitment, and each will have an opportunity to make comments after they receive the award. This evening's first award recipient is Dr. Jack Daniel. Dr. Jack Daniel grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, beginning in public housing work. In 1960, he was admitted on academic probation to the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown. He earned 3 degrees over the span of 8 years, a BS in psychology, an MA in speech communication, and a PhD in speech communication. He was an American Council on Education Fellow at Stanford University during the 1973-1974 academic year, and was a Harvard Institute for Education Management Fellow in 1986. After serving as the first chair of Black Studies, he served as Dean, Vice Provost, and Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Pittsburgh. He taught courses and conducted research in Black communication. In 2010, he received the National Communication Association Black Caucus's Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2018, he received a National Communication Association Presidential Citation for service for outstanding scholarship and activism chronicling the NCA Black Caucus. With his son, Amari C. Daniel, he co-authored We Fish, The Journey to Fatherhood. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause for the recipient of the 2019 Alan Lesko Award for Excellence in Urban Education, Dr. Jack Daniel.
I was asked to be brief because they know sometimes I preach. I'm going to, in terms of the award, I'm going to just say what my mama taught me. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. In terms of Dr. Nasir's talk, I'd like to return to where she began, for my people, and where she ended, hope. I'm retired, and I'm reminded that folks have 3 dashes in their lives. My first dash says born in 1942. And I don't want that last dash to come. I want to stay here as long as I can. But in the middle is the dash you run. And I've tried to run a dash for my people. But if you run the dash for my people, it's long, it's hard. Sometimes you don't think you're gonna make it. When you turn to come home in the stretch, you feel like rigor mortis or something's gonna set in, and you feel like the spiritual that says, way down there in the valley, no other hope I see. But you struggle to get home. And when you get home and you're running the dash and it's really a long relay, you hope. You hope that who you hand it off to, that baton, that they will run swiftly, that they too will run for my people. And I have hope, because I'm telling you, when I first heard that Dean Valerie's sister was going to be the Dean of Education at Pitt, I said, my Lord. Oh, look at here, look at here. And then I heard she had boasted the relay team, brought in a man named Dancy. And I said, look at here, look at here, look at here, look at here. Because what we need are scholar warriors. I'm telling you, I just met him today for the first time in person. But you got a scholar warrior who has the baton, who's running swiftly. He's so young, he's not going to get tired. And I'm just so glad to see who's got the baton. Run on, brother, run on.
Thank you, Dr. Daniel. I can't say I don't get tired sometimes. Our second Let's Go Award recipient is Wanda Henderson. Wanda Henderson is from Brooklyn, New York, and came to Pittsburgh as a University of Pittsburgh student on the heels of the 1969 Black Action Society Computer Center sit-in. Although her degree and career was in economics and accounting, she was inspired by the late Dr. Barbara Sizemore to advocate on behalf of students of color in our schools who she understood as miseducated and mistreated. She has served in leadership roles in various organizations, such as the Advocates for African American Students in Pittsburgh Public Schools, Pittsburgh Public Schools Head Start and Title I Parent Councils, the National Coalition of Title I Parents, and Pittsburgh NAACP Education Committee. Wanda and her husband Howard are blessed with 3 sons and 6 grandchildren. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause for the recipient of the 2019 Allen Lesko Award for Excellence in Urban Education, Wanda Henderson. And I don't believe she can be with us tonight, but we do have a family member or representative on her behalf. Please welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Imani Campbell. I am very honored to be accepting this award on behalf of my grandmother, Wanda Henderson. For me, it's not only been educational, but yet inspiring to see her work so hard and for so long for something she believes in. Since I was little, she's always taught me the difference between equity and equality, and she fights for both, and more so equity. For African American students. I'd really like to thank her for being one of those people that stand and are the voice for, even at one point, not even I knew I needed. So in that, I'd like to say on her behalf, thank you, and that she's very blessed and honored to be receiving this award today. Thank you.
Our third and final Let's Go Award recipient this semester is Angel Gober. Daughter of a public school teacher, Angel Gober has been a dedicated activist and organizer for the past 15 years. Her work as a parent organizer has driven the campaigns against school pushout and ending the school-to-prison pipeline. She has fought for sustainable community schools, early education, and raising the minimum wage in Pittsburgh. In 2010, as part of a coalition of labor, community, faith-based, and environmental organizations, Angel worked to pass the city's prevailing wage for service workers and clean water laws. Her background in housing justice led her to become a political strategist, developing Black leadership in local systems of power. Currently, Angel is the Western Pennsylvania Director with One Pennsylvania, a social justice membership organization of grandmas, parents, guardians, and cranky uncles working together to follow the money, confront the power, and create the change. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause for the recipient of the 2019 Allen Lesko Award for Excellence in Urban Education, Angel Gober.
Yes, we have cranky uncles part of the team for sure. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. This is such an honor. I'm always very awkward when I get awards just because I work with an amazing team of dedicated parents that are fighting the education justice system every day just so their kids could get educated. So I'm actually accepting this award on behalf of them because I would not be here if it wasn't for my fellow education warriors, you know. So One Pennsylvania, we are a membership-based organization. We have a phenomenal parent base. We are focused on ending the school-to-prison pipeline and ending school push-out. What that looks like in Pittsburgh Public Schools is that majority of kids that are pushed out or for minor behavioral things, the over-policing of our students is problematic, especially our Black and brown students, our Black boys with IEPs are the #1 target. And so, you know, we don't have special degrees, we don't have PhDs, we know that we are moms, and we know that we have to fight a system that was designed to oppress us, to make sure that our kids get educated, right? So regular parents passing laws to stop suspending kids pre-K to second grade for nonviolent offenses. We're actually going to the school board public hearing on Monday, and I welcome all of you to join because we are going to ask the school district to move that suspension ban up to the 5th grade because we cannot tolerate our black babies being pushed out away from their education and moved into the criminal justice system. So I challenge you all to, yep. And so we can't do it by ourselves, right? So we need folks to come out and go through the democratic process, right? We elect school board members, we challenge school board members, we hold them accountable. Devin Telefero and Pam Harbin, they will be newly elected school board members in December, and they absolutely care about not hardening our schools and not policing our students, but how do we put more services and supports in the schools instead of calling the police on kids. So I just want to, again, thank you so much for this award. I will be sharing it with my folks. Please follow me on Facebook, Twitter, whatever, if you want to get involved, because you know, it's nice to get up here and get these kinds of awards, but we really have to take it to the streets and really build power and educate our folks on how to challenge the system. Thank you. And I think I want to thank Derek Heck, I think, who nominated me for this award, who is way on the West Coast. So thank you, Derek Heck. I love you. Even though the first time we met, we fought. But we are the best of friends right now. So thank you.
I want to take a minute to acknowledge all of the people who help keep CUE going. When your name or affiliation is called, please stand to be recognized, and please remain standing until we transition. Heinz Endowments, is there a representative with us? The Grable Foundation, the Year of Diversity, Richard and Shelley Milner, Alan and Sharon Lesgo, and Bobby and Robert Gaunt for supporting our work. Thank you. Thank you. And because people are an integral part of the work we do at the Center for Urban Education, I would like to acknowledge some people who support the center in extraordinary ways. I don't believe that our Dean, Valerie Kinlock, is with her, but we certainly are fortunate to have the supportive leadership of a trailblazing Dean in Dr. Valerie Kinlock. So in her absence, we acknowledge her. To the CUE team, and if you're here, would you please stand and remain standing? Lori DeLele O'Connor, Dana Thompson Dorsey, Jason Mendez, Kenny Donaldson, Cassia Krogan, Devonna Graham, Christopher Wright, Shay Dawkins Law, Christy McGuire, Geneva Daughtry, Cassandra Brentley, Chelsea Jimenez, Iman Sandifer, Jeremy Chaco, and Jawanza Rand. So this is the team that I'm fortunate to get to work with every day, a group of brilliant, thoughtful, generous individuals. Would you please join me in giving them a round of applause? Thank you. And we're so fortunate, you may be seated. We're so fortunate to have wonderful undergraduate student workers that support everything we do at the center. Thank you, Anisha, Sequoia, Aaron, and Priyanka. With the following groups, please stand and be recognized at this time, and please remain standing until the end. The Center for Urban Education Heinz Fellows, if you're with us. Excellent. And the Center for Urban Education faculty fellows or graduate student fellows who are with us. And School of Education Urban Scholars. thank you all for the work that you do to improve urban education. You may be seated. And so before we break for the reception, we have come to the end. Let me just say that we hope to see you at our upcoming events. Please join us tomorrow evening, Wednesday, October 24th, at Reflection into Action, as we work to move what we heard here from Dr. Nasir into action for our communities, and that will be led by one of our Let's Go Award winners, Dr. Jack Daniel. So we're very excited about that event. It is, again, tomorrow, 4:30 to 6:30 p.m. at the Energy Innovation Center on Bedford Avenue. CUE also features Lunch and Learns, which are monthly talks that take place around the traditional lunchtime hour, 11:45 to 1:15 p.m. We're excited about our talk November 7th, Black Women, Black Feminism, Learning from the Intersections. And then on December 5th, we will feature Dr. Kamika Royal from Loyola, who will discuss black education in Philadelphia teacher strikes. And then join Kamika and me and Professor Kirsten Scott from Literature and Composition for a CUE Director and Friends book study on Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. So that concludes today's fall lecture. Thank you all for coming. We hope that you will join us just outside the doors for a brief reception.